epilepsy. Okay, so let's talk about, for a moment, the medical side of things. Okay, we haven't touched on that this evening. So we'll talk about epilepsy. I'm going to throw some facts and some figures at you first. There are 65 million people worldwide suffering from an epilepsy-related condition. 65 million people worldwide. There are over 250,000 Australians living with epilepsy at the moment in Australia. And 3 to 3.5% of Australians will experience epilepsy at some point in their life. That's quite a lot. Now, SUDEP, sudden epilepsy, sudden onset, okay, occurs in 1 in 1,000 adults and 1 in 4,500 children with epilepsy. So from that 250,000 people with epilepsy in Australia, 1 in 1,000 of the adults in there will have SUDEP, and 1 in 4,500 of the children in that will have SUDEP. Now, as I said, that's sudden onset epilepsy. So it's no control, no real therapy, no treatment. You're on basically tranquilizers and steroids in a comatose state. You know, we're talking about wearing a nappy kind of thing, helmet. Okay. Okay, so what we got here. So the statistical breakdown of the epilepsy population of Australia is the children, from that 250,000 of them, as 40% children, 30% adults, and 25% elderly. Now, epilepsy-related causes of death account for 40% of mortality in persons of epilepsy. All right? So 40% of that 250,000 people are going to die from an epilepsy-related, sort of something related to their epilepsy. SUDEP accounts for 8 to 17% of deaths in people with epilepsy. So what are we looking at? That's a lot of deaths. Okay, so 1 in 4,500 of the kids are going to die, 1 in 1,000 of the parents, and 1 in 1,000 of the elderly. So that's we're talking about huge. Now that's just Australia's base sort of figures, but as I said, 65 million people worldwide, 1 in 1,000 of them, okay, will die. 40% of them are going to die from some sort of epilepsy-related reasoning. So it's a phenomenal condition. Now, cannabis, up until it being banned back in the 20s, was the go-to treatment for epilepsy here in the West. So if you had epilepsy in 1901 or even 1915 or 1920 and you went to the doctor and he went, "Oh, you got epilepsy, here, take this," he would give you a cannabis-based treatment and you would go on and you would have a quality of life. When cannabis was banned and taken away from medical use, it wasn't just banned, it wasn't just, "Oh, look, we don't want people smoking that, so we're gonna say you can't have it unless it's for medical only," you know, like heroin and cocaine and things like that, which are still are there for use in medical because they have a reason, but they don't let people, you know, sit there and go and buy it off the supermarket shelf, right? But cannabis, they didn't do that. They said no more use at all. But it's the only thing then, and the only thing now, that effectively treats epilepsy. See, this is it. 65 million people around the world today are suffering needlessly. Because if cannabis was legal, they wouldn't be suffering. It's not going to cure their epilepsy, but what it does do is it safely treats it. It alleviates the spasms because it's an antispasmodic. Now, we've been using an antispasmodic in the West, 1600s or something. Get back in Western medicine, you won't find a formulary without cannabis extracts in it prior to it being removed. Which worries me when you look at doctors today that say, "Oh, I don't know if it has any medical value," and I don't know if you have any medical knowledge. Because only someone without medical knowledge would know that it has no medical value. Because anyone that had taken the time to do any research whatsoever would find that it has a great deal of medical value. So when a doctor says to you it has no medical value, your doctor is telling you he's an idiot and has no education whatsoever when it comes to medicine. Keep that in mind. They probably won't appreciate you reminding them of that, but, why not? You're not there to make them feel better, remember? Write the funkiest things in these notebooks. I've actually just come across here that Operation Apsley, the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission into VicPol. IBAC stated the substantiated allegations against 8 officers were likely to be just snapshots of a more widespread and serious problem for Victoria Police. IBAC Commissioner Stephen O'Brien, QC, stated, while most of the officers investigated were aware they were engaging in illegal conduct, they rationalised their off-duty criminality as being separate to their obligations as police officers. This can only be spun as if they know it's harmless, so use it with no fear. Victoria's Police's alcohol and drugs policy says illicit drug use is not tolerated, but there was ambiguity about the consequences. IBAC, they said, of those 8 officers, 2 were charged with giving false evidence, misleading, attempting to mislead IBAC and inciting a witness to mislead IBAC. Of 1 was charged with criminal drug offences, 1 was dismissed, 3 have resigned, 3 are suspended, 1 returned to work after an admonishment notice. See, that's VicPol, and that's from their that's an extract that I've scribbled down from obviously something I was looking at some stage in the last year. The one bad thing is that I got this habit of like writing a page and then skipping pages, or writing a page where it's the page next to it's already got stuff on it, and then skipping it and going on to something else, because then stuff gets lost. So some of the causes of the deaths from epilepsy, of that 40% of deaths. So we've got underlying neurological disorder in symptomatic epilepsy, SUDEP, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, accidents during attack, drowning, traffic, fire, choking, head trauma, status epilepticus, suicide, treatment-related death, focus on epilepsy treatment, and lay every death since cannabis reform was first promised at their feet. See, that's me writing notes to myself, because that's basically it. When they took cannabis out of play, they, without putting in a replacement, because this is the thing. So, 65 million people today. How many millions over this near 100 years of cannabis being removed have suffered and died needlessly because this treatment was withdrawn? Wasn't replaced, was withdrawn. An effective treatment with no harmful side effects was withdrawn and is still withdrawn. Right? 65 million people around the world suffering today, 250,000 people of Australians suffering today, and they still go, no, keep suffering. Because that's what they're doing. They're not saying, no, people aren't allowed to smoke cannabis, because, mate, $13 billion is spent every year in Australia on cannabis products by people buying it to consume. So prohibition doesn't stop the consumption or the industry of cannabis. What it does do is it keeps 250,000 Australians suffering on a day-to-day basis, except for those that are choosing to become criminals and are illegally sourcing cannabis to use for their epilepsy. And that's a growing number, because drugs like Lycra and Keppra here in Australia, drugs that are used predominantly in epilepsy treatment, are dropping in sales over 20 billion a year. Where's all that money going? $20 million in a drop in sales in one drug alone, an epilepsy treatment drug, because epilepsy sufferers are not getting that prescription, because it's harder on them. It impacts their quality of life. It destroys their organs through overtoxicity. So it's safer to become a criminal than it is to take prescription drugs. And when you look at the fact that we've got opioid epidemic proportion overdoses around the world from prescription drugs, you can, you can understand why people choose to source an illegal drug and take the risks of being robbed, ripped off, shot, assaulted, or take a prescription drug. Oh no, it's safer to take that and take the risk of being assaulted, robbed, ripped off, and all of those. It's safer to do that than take a prescription drug. Think about the logic of that. Because we're not talking about people that are buying it to get stoned. We're talking about your everyday person that is suffering from a condition that they should be allowed to safely and legally treat, but they're not. So they have to go to the lengths of going to the illegal supplier. So they're willing to go to those kind of lengths, to take those kind of risks, because they feel that risk is less of a risk upon them than taking the prescription drug. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know in many ways. So these people that are suffering, because the government's saying you have to keep suffering, because that's all they're saying when they're saying we're not going to end prohibition, they are saying, no, I want you to suffer. I want your child to suffer. I enjoy watching you suffer. That's what they're saying. Your member for Parliament, your member for the Senate, they're telling you that they just love the idea of you and your children suffering, that they thrive on the vulnerable suffering in pain, because that is the only justification for maintaining prohibition, a prohibition that does not work to stop the use of cannabis. Causes suffering, harms the vulnerable, doesn't stop the cannabis. Oh, I love that. I literally... what have we got here? There we go. By opening the door to organised crime by using and supplying drugs... Oh, this is a continuation of the IBEC stuff. The officers compromised themselves, leading to other crimes and a culture of corruption within the force, using evidence of a drug use to observe and manipulate officers into complicity or participation in other criminal behaviour, turning a blind eye to the criminal activities of other officers in no matter the seriousness of the offences, such as Victorian police officer who used his authority and position to rape and abuse children over a 12-year period, despite parents reporting the abuse. No right-minded individual could ignore such evil and despicable behaviour, and yet for 12 years Victoria Police did exactly that. They had a known pedophile within their ranks. I mean, this pedophile picked up a child at a showground and raped the child in the back of the division van on the showground property. The child was lost, looking for its parent. Oh, no, I'll help you, come with me. Took the child into a division van and raped that child, stuck his penis into that child's mouth. That's what a police officer, a serving police officer on duty. And even after the public continually reported the activities of this officer, nothing happened. 12 years this continued. Not 1 day, not 2 days, not a week, not 2 weeks, not 12 months. 12 years. By ending the illicit nature of present supply structures and removing the enormous wealth from organised crime and the corruption within the system, our police members can indulge in legal drugs on off-duty without being left open to extortion. Cannabis is the platform and theme of the policy. Oh, that's just my scribbles there. Okay. Here's a little something. Live, this is one of my scribbles. Live by whatever faith you wish, however understand and accept. that no religious considerations will be taken into account in regards to the public utilities and services. No exemptions from tax, and no religion-owned business will be eligible for public contracts from government-funded services. Halal certification fees will be taxed, donations will not, but income derived from them will. That sounds fair, doesn't it? This target represents a 50 to 50% reduction in emissions per capita and a 60 to 64% reduction in the emission intensity of the economy between 2005 and 2030, referred to the independent report by Alan Finkel regarding issues with meeting targets. See, they talk about a lot of confusing stuff, don't they? AGL boss earned $6.9 million in 2017. Contemplate that. Right, that's his yearly income. $6.9 million. The present stakeholders in the energy sector have a vested interest in not investing in renewable energy production. Their goal is not to provide electricity, but to create a market to sell their primary product, which is fossil fuel. If fossil fuel is not acceptable as a fuel, they have no vested interest in providing electricity. We need a clean energy sector based on renewables, new industries. Oh, that's right. These are my notes for the thing. Okay, for the production. Okay, so section 2A. The viability of biofuels, global production and use, methanol compared to available alternative fuels and emission reductions. Just the things that I'm going to put in there. Yeah, so I spent some time and I created this thing called the Priority Resource Development Initiative, which is basically allowing Australia to annex certain things that it considers to be a primary resource in order to achieve the country's goals on renewable fuel, without being detrimental, obviously, to the producer of that product. So it's basically allowing us to focus on the production of a fuel and the production of the technology to produce that fuel within a structure to provide for an Australian development opportunity rather than individual businesses, by having it as a government, community, public. And see, when I say government, I don't mean the present government, I mean a government that actually represents the people, to actually have this renewable industry coming in as grassroots. It belongs to the people, because what we really first and foremostly need to secure our future is to secure our energy security, and to do so in a manner that's environmentally friendly and sustainable. Now, I have actually, believe it or not, found a way to do that. Once again, I'll go back to the hemp seeds. Hemp seed is an amazing product with so many different uses, and it's got this really, really great benefit of a lot of byproduct, as in the plant that the seed comes from. Now, most of you will go, oh yeah, but it's hemp, you just use it for, jeans and paper and stuff. Actually, no. When you're growing seeds, you actually have to let the plant mature beyond when they harvest cannabis for hemp. It actually has to become woody, so that the seed pods become loose. It makes it easier to harvest the seeds from them. So what actually happens is the plant gets big and tall and chewy, and the actual byproduct, the actual leftover on the field after the harvest has gone through, is about 7 tonne an acre of byproduct. Now, that is biocellulistic mass, biomass. It can actually be distilled, turned into a fuel, believe it or not. And when you actually start looking at expanding the hemp seed industry, as it's going to do, as it did in Canada over the last 10 years, it, as a byproduct, produces phenomenal amounts of waste that can be processed into biomethanol, ethanol, which I mentioned before, can be run through our existing gas turbine systems in our power plants that we have right now. Now, this fuel is carbon neutral. It's a renewable, it's 100% renewable, and natural. Keeps growing. Okay? It's also a second generation fuel, because it's not the primary purpose of the crop, the seed is. It's actually waste. It comes under certain classifications as a second generation, not a first generation, which is like when they grow corn or sugar to make fuel. which brings into play what they call the food versus fuel debate, where you're using the resources such as land and water and so forth to grow fuel when you could be growing food. You're also selling something as a fuel that gets a better price than if it was being sold as a food, so then it starts to mess with the pricing structure. So there's a lot of impacts and negatives that have come in when it comes down to the biofuel industry, because they've always found this financial way of screwing it up. I've come in from another direction. I've come in from a waste product, keeping in mind that this is 100% waste. It doesn't have any other use. At present, this is being reploughed back into the soil. Okay? Pure and simple. It's wasted. It is potentially our electricity, because it cleanly burns with low emission. Okay? It's classified as a clean fuel. It's also 100% renewable. It's also 100% waste product. Okay? And the same systems that we use to turn this fuel into electricity can take the soft rubbish from local councils. So your garbage, like your food rotting and things like that, that can actually be into this system, because it's not just for that. It's unviable to do it just for refuse, but a system that can accept refuse into its existing primary purpose. All of a sudden, you're looking at minimising landfills. Once again, a benefit to the environment. So the biggest plus is I've built this plan around supplanting the hemp seed industry onto the canola industry in Australia, because canola is a really negative plant. It used to be called rapeseed. It's genetically modified, and it's not worth a great deal to the farmer. So because the canola seed industry is quite large at the moment, if we were to take every acre, and I've built my plan around the Victorian croppings and the figures and the facts, we can actually provide, I think it was 70% of Victoria's energy needs, or present energy needs, just by growing hemp seeds on the acreage that's presently being used by canola in the waste alone. What we're talking about there is creating this whole new agriculturally based energy sector. Ooh, it's great. Environmentally friendly, new industry in the country where the jobs are needed, where country towns are dying. All of a sudden you've got jobs, you've got industry. And when you've got power, electricity production happening in those kind of areas, what happens then? Industry follows, because it's cheap electricity, right? You start having transportation. You start to see growth. You start to see potential for a better future for everyone, because that's what we're looking at building, as a better future for the country and for the people in it, not for these one or two individuals that own corporations. Look at people like Dick Smith. He pisses me off. He's a man that raped the workforce of this country, paid minimum wage, shonky as shonk could be, sold pile after pile of imported rubbish, and now stands there going, buy Australian or you're not an Aussie. Support Australian businesses. What, at any point in his time when he was building up his big fucking chain around Australia, did he bother creating something in Australia? He didn't, did he? No. He brought in cheap shit from overseas and he flooded the market here. That's Dick Smith. Don't ever forget that. Dick Smith's not a good man. Dick Smith just wants what all of the rich people want when they've got the money. They want power over people, because that's the only thing that makes them feel good. Like we're chess pieces on a board. Fuck you, Dick.